Hello everyone and welcome back to Briks with Bask. Once again, this is the side series of the Common Ascent podcast where I build Lego sets inspired by episodes of the podcast. This time we're doing Silver Screen Science episode since it is Silver Screen Science month. And the one that came up was the modern Godzilla movies, so we're doing Godzilla 2014. We did this way back when we did the KaiJune series and did a bunch of Godzilla and King Kong episodes and movies. So let's hop right in. Obviously, I am incredibly excited to get to build Godzilla. One of my favorite movie franchises, one of my favorite movie monsters. I'm a big Godzilla fan, as many of you longtime listeners probably know. So I'm going to build a posable figure of Godzilla. I am specifically building the 2014 version of Godzilla, so that's the Legendary Studios version of Godzilla. You know, the first movie that started the MonsterVerse cinematic universe, which is exciting because I like that design of Godzilla very much. They talk about this in like the behind the scenes and stuff, that the goal was to try to make a more physically reasonable Godzilla. Like, they gave him very pillar-like legs, like an elephant. You know, the foot that I'm working on currently is very elephantine. They gave him proportions that felt a little more realistic for an animal that size. You know, of course, the size that Godzilla's at is impossible for any organism to get to. It's very likely that things like sauropods and whales, so long-necked dinosaurs and the blue whale are as big as animals can get. But the movie makers made an effort to try to redesign Godzilla so that he had a bit more reasonable proportions and natural anatomy that actually would feel like an animal that size might have, or would at least feel like he could move around and, function at that size. They did other things that we can talk about more later, but, like they gave him gills since he's so heavily aquatic. And I like this. I like this version of Godzilla. It's very animalistic and very cool design. I like the long, slim tail. We'll see that later on, but I'm a big fan. I like building posable figures. I'm very much of the mentality that if I can't pose it, then a little bit, what's the point? I've always been preferred to be able to have toys that were posable and allowed me to play with them how I saw fit. I wasn't a big fan of the kung fu grip action type toys that did one gimmick. I prefer it to be posable and let me, make up what I want the toy to do. So making a figure like that makes a ton of sense. The size range I'm going to be aiming for, which I think I got pretty close, is actually the S.H.MonsterArts Bandai line of toys that makes a lot of really high quality Godzilla figures, and this should end up being around that size category, so it should be able to stand on the shelf alongside figures like that. Getting into the ankle joint here, I'm trying to figure out how to keep the proportions, make Godzilla look big and chunky while still giving them posability, and giving the ankle enough flexibility to actually be posed and functional, but still strong enough to hold up what's going to be a fairly chunky Lego figure. Not as big as they can get, but still not small either. And we're getting into the columnar, column-like legs that Godzilla has, which is always, Godzilla comes up a lot when we talk about things like speculative evolution, of how would Godzilla evolve. And of course, as I already said, something the size of Godzilla would be impossible to evolve. The physics just don't work out. You wouldn't even be able to stand upright as an organism at the size Godzilla's at, which the legendary Godzilla is supposed to be over 300 feet tall and over 500 feet long. And that is just a size category. 5 times the length of the longest long-necked dinosaurs and the blue whale is just, that's too big of an animal to actually function, let alone stand up outside of water. But it does bring up questions of how do animals get so big? And it is a fun discussion. We definitely know that Godzilla's too big to exist. But then questions will come up of, all right, but then how do the biggest animals that exist get so big? How do they manage their size? And some things are consistent, like elephants. They have column-like legs. They have a lot of areas of their skeleton where weight has been lessened. So like if Godzilla did exist, we'd expect that its skeleton would be full of air chambers. We see the same thing in sauropods, that you can't just have solid bone skeleton when you're going to be that big. You have to lighten it as much as possible. It's the same way when we build skyscrapers, where we can't build a skyscraper just out of solid concrete because it would collapse under its own weight. That's why we start using steel beams that are shaped in a way to make them as strong as possible with as little weight as possible. Animals do the same thing. Godzilla would likely have a skeleton full of air chambers. Not that that would make it weak. Birds have bones full of air chambers, and their bones are still strong enough to let them fly, which is an incredibly intense thing for them to do. But for here, they would need it in the extreme. Elephant skulls are actually fairly light for their size, and are not nearly as heavy as you might expect to be. Still would be heavy, because the skull's almost as big as, a grown adult human, but not nearly as heavy as our skull would be if you just scaled up a human skull to the same size. Ours would be much denser. So we do see some constant things like that, lessening of weight in certain categories. We don't see the same thing as much in whales because they're able to float in the ocean, so they don't need to worry about his weight as much. But since Godzilla is coming on land, we would expect kaiju like him to be lightening the load. But there's also mysteries involved. We've talked about this when we did our whale episodes and a sauropod episode, that we don't actually know how or why those animals got as big as they got. Because when you look at life on Earth, most life falls within a size range of things down to like rodent-sized all the way up to things that are about like rhino-sized or elephant-sized, depending on what time period you're looking at. And that's fairly consistent. Like the biggest dinosaurs outside of sauropods, T-Rex and Triceratops type animals are roughly elephant-sized. Give or take a little bit, they're similar size. The biggest mammals, there are bigger mammals than today's elephants, still were in roughly the same size category as today's elephants. Bigger, heavier, but not, 5 times or whatever. Still relatively similar size category. And then we have animals in every size category in between the small ones and the large ones. You have medium-sized animals, large-sized animals, big animals, and the giant animals. And then there's a size jump when you go from something elephant-sized to sauropod-sized, or even in the ocean. There's tons of things that range up to like orca size. And then a big size gap between them and the filter-feeding whales that can be truly gigantic. And we're not sure why we don't see that gradient continue. We don't know why we don't see animals that are a little bit bigger than an elephant and then twice as big and then 3 times as big and then, work your way up to sauropod. That gap's missing. There are smaller sauropods, but even the smallest sauropods are still very large. And so there's this interesting trend that seems to happen with a lot of giant animals, that they are in a separate category altogether. And therefore, they may be living a very different way. We know some of the adaptations that allow them to get so big, but we don't know exactly. Like for sauropods, we don't know all the answers as to how they were able to survive at that size. And with them and whales, it's hard to answer why did they need to be so big? What was the benefit? And so if kaiju existed, I'm sure the same question would come up of what is the benefit to being so huge? Is there something particular that comes along with it? Some obvious answers are protection from predators and defense from other animals. The bigger you are, the harder you are to fight or to hunt, so the safer you are. It also might make you travel better. That would make tons of sense for something like Godzilla, who is circling the globe, defending the planet as its territory. It also can make you better at handling long periods without food. You have more fat storage, so you can survive tougher times for a while. It also tends to increase the age span of an animal. The bigger animals tend to live longer. Things size of an elephant, or even the step down to like rhino and hippo size, tend to outlive the oldest rodents and small lizards and stuff. Smaller animals tend to have faster metabolisms, which means they tend to age quicker. So it's expected something the size of Godzilla would probably have a massive lifespan, centuries potentially, like a tortoise. But otherwise, it's still a bit of a mystery why some animals throughout Earth's history have gotten so big. What was the benefit to being so massive? And it's a hard question to answer because it's only happened a handful of times in Earth's history. Those two groups, filter-feeding whales and sauropods, are really the two extreme examples of life getting truly massive, of animal life getting truly massive, and we don't know exactly what drove them to become so big. Which is, I like asking that question here because the legendary Godzilla movies very much portray the kaiju, the titans as they're called in the films, as natural animals. They propose that these are animals that evolved here on Earth. While in like the old Godzilla movies, very often for many of them, they were created through accidents. Godzilla was mutated, quote unquote, by atomic weapons testing. And so for many of them, they were animals that had been changed somehow. But in the legendary franchise, they are portrayed as natural animals. So if they did exist, these would be questions that people would be asking in the MonsterVerse world of why did they get so big? Why does Godzilla need to be so large? Does something about being a radioactive animal benefit from being larger? Is it like a sun where, or a star, that a body in space can't become a star unless it has enough mass to it, that only then doesn't have enough gravity to compress itself into a star? Maybe there's something like that with the kaiju, that to be a radioactive animal, you need a certain amount of mass to, manage the heat exchange, or to have enough matter to have your nuclear reaction and provide your energy with, or something to that effect. Maybe it's something like that. There definitely could be a arms race sort of thing that, Godzilla's a predator feeding on other radioactive big animals, and as they maybe get bigger to defend themselves from the Godzilla's species gets larger to compete. If we treat the hollow Earth that it is portrayed that the kaiju came from in that franchise as like an island ecosystem, then maybe you get a closed system like that where they are hyper evolving in relation to one another, and you get these giant organisms. So just fun questions to think about and ask in relation to this version of Godzilla is what evolutionary pressures would make you need to be 550 feet long is an interesting question. And obviously there is not a reasonable answer because this is not possible and the movies are not meant to be evolutionary examples, but it is a fun thought experiment to ask of what kind of evolutionary pressures would we have expected Godzilla's lineage to go through during their evolution? How would this size have benefited this species? I do very much like the idea that it has something to do with their radioactive nature. Godzilla is a creature that feeds on radioactivity and has an atomic breath weapon. So there's definitely an argument to be made that that is such a specialized lifestyle that it requires a massive body size for the physics to work. There's definitely aspects of that with like elephants. Elephants are landscape engineers. They reshape forests and they knock over trees and they clear space for grasslands. So they are a big part of maintaining the grasslands of, specifically Africa is often used as the example. But without them, the forest would take over large areas of grassland, which would make for forested environments, but would take away the grassland environments that many other animals rely on. But the only reason elephants are able to do that is because of their size. They are not particularly strong for like their anatomy. They're not disproportionately strong for their body size. The only reason they're so strong is because they're so big. There was a old Animal Planet special I watched back when I was a kid that was Animal Olympics, and they took the major categories of animals, like fish, mammals, reptiles, insects, and had them each compete in Olympic competitions. And for weightlifting, mammals used the elephant, but all the animals were scaled against each other, and the elephants lost out because when you scale an elephant down, they're actually not particularly strong for their size, because it's their stature that gives them the immense strength that they have over their environment. If they were our size, they would still be probably a powerful animal, but not unusually so. They wouldn't just be picking up cows if they were the size of a cow. They would be the strength of a cow-sized elephant. So there are some things that don't scale. To be able to knock over trees, you need to be on the size category of an animal that is closer to the size of a tree and can knock it over. So maybe there is something with Godzilla that, like, you can't be an atomically powered chihuahua because that's just not big enough for nuclear reactions to happen at. You would need to be the size of a city block because now there's enough real estate inside that body to have a small biological nuclear power plant going. I have no clue if that actually makes sense. I'm not a physicist. I am definitely not a radiologist, or not a radiologist, but a person who studies radiation and radioactive isotopes and stuff. So I don't know if that makes any sense at all. But it almost does, and that's what Godzilla functions off of. It's things that almost make sense. I guess I should talk about the build some. Build's coming along. This is one of those fun builds where I just started at the feet and built up to the hips and built down to the tail, and now I'm building up the torso. It's a very satisfying way for me to build, is I just start at one end of what I'm building and just keep building until I'm at the other end and the build is done. I had to make a major update here because I wanted to give Godzilla a chest swivel, a chest/waist swivel, so that way it's got a little bit more posability, since the torso is going to mostly just be a blocky shape. I'm not quite skilled enough in building figures to give it more complex articulation, but so far I'm extremely satisfied with this build. I mentioned the fact that this Godzilla's got a long, slender tail, and I really like that. Most Godzillas have kind of a chunky, rounded tail, and they end in kind of a blunt tip, and I like that this Godzilla had a very reptilian tail. It feels like a lizard tail that ends in a very fine point. That's just a very satisfying feature for me. I thought that was fun. I'm also really happy with being able to find these craggy rock features to act as Godzilla's spine. There's something always super satisfying when doing a Lego build, when you just find a piece and you're like, oh hey, that's the exact shape I need. Thank you, Lego, for already designing the shape I need for what I'm building. I don't have to be clever. You all were clever for me. These are great, and they fit this Godzilla because he doesn't have the Stegosaurus-like flattened and wide dorsal spines yet. This Godzilla's were more like stalagmites, or like jagged rocks almost coming off the back. And once again, that's a fun look. I'm sure there are some people who aren't as big a fan of it, but I thought it was a fun change of pace. I like this Godzilla a lot. Let's see, what else? This is an interesting build since it's not a scientific topic. There's not as much like hard facts for me to give. And I'm not going to do like movie trivia because I don't know the movie trivia off the top of my head. But I can talk about the film. We do, when we do Silver Screen Science, we do more thoughts where we talk about our opinions. So I'm not going to give just the entire rundown that I would have on that episode. But I can give you a little taste of it in that I like this movie. A lot of people aren't a big fan of this movie because Godzilla's not in most of it. The Mutos were a bit of a surprise for a lot of people. I guess slight spoilers, but I'm not going to be going over like the plot, just my thoughts. The Mutos were a surprise for a lot of people since they were a new kaiju and not a classic Toho Studios Godzilla kaiju. But I thought they were fun kaiju. I thought they were a cool concept. And yes, this Godzilla's not in a bunch of it, but it feels like it is a satisfying build-up to Godzilla showing up. And no, it's not a perfect film. There's definitely some slow bits. There's definitely some parts that are questionable choice of usage with the human characters. But all in all, I thought it was a interesting take. I thought it was a refreshing take to treat Godzilla like a natural disaster in many ways, and the utter shock and devastation that a creature this large would cause. And so I am perfectly satisfied with this film. I know it gets a lot of flack, but for being boring, and it's definitely not the most exciting of the franchise, but I'm a fan, so that's why I was so excited to get to build this set. I'm sure more will come along as we could do future Silver Screen Science builds in this series, but at least at the current pace, you'll have to wait till next year, and then I'll pick another movie. So maybe we'll get to do more Godzilla movies later on, but next year we'll see what we pick out for the build for next April. In case anyone is wondering, that is how I pick out the episodes for this series. Is I randomly draw a number and then pick the podcast episode that correlates with that. And as indicated here, I plan to try to theme it to the time of the year a bit. If we're doing specific stuff, I'll pick episodes that are appropriate. And so we're I'm almost done with the body. Got the torso coming up. You're finishing up. Just got to fill in that rest of the back. So we'll get that done and then move on to the neck and head. Now I'm just trying to get the profile of those back spines right. It's got to get the right silhouette to really capture. Not that it wouldn't be obvious who it's supposed to be, but I want it to feel like Godzilla when you glance at it. Now moving on to the neck and head. Neck, pretty easy to get done. And here I pause before getting to the head because, as you'll see, the head is going to be challenging. It's trying to get a lot of detail into a very small part of the build. So I'm going to do the arms really quick because arms are pretty straightforward. I'll knock those out and then get to the face. But speaking of Godzilla's face, one of the big questions that I've always had about Godzilla, and this version of Godzilla included, is if Godzilla feeds off of radiation, which we see examples of in the old movies, or at least that Godzilla is attracted to radiation. But if Godzilla feeds off of radiation, why does Godzilla got teethers in his mouth? Why does Godzilla have a bunch of sharp teeth in his mouth? Does he feed off radiation from other kaiju by eating their body and then digesting their radioactive material? Is that what they mean by feed off radiation? But then we also get a number of examples in this franchise where Godzilla absorbs radiation. So why does it have teeth? And this is often something that happens with movie monsters, where the movie monster is built like a normal animal. Clawed hands, toothy mouth, big tail, built like most animals you would expect, but then we scale it up to the size of a building. And now a lot of those features don't make a lot of sense. Why? Why would you need to be shaped that way? We see that with big animals, big sauropods and stuff aren't shaped like other dinosaurs. They're shaped very differently. That has to do with the physics of being so large. But also, they don't need the same adaptations for the same reasons. Like, they aren't moving quickly, so they don't need to maintain their balance while running, so you don't see features for that. You don't see running features in them at all because they can't run. So you often will get that with giant movie monsters, that they are shaped like normal animals, but just far too big. And it actually gets to the point where they stop making full sense in why they're shaped that way. So I got the start of Godzilla's head, but it's just too tall, too round. The eye gap wasn't satisfying, and everything else I'm trying with the eyes is just too big. So I just can't get the face and the snout, because this Godzilla has a very narrow snout. Not long, but a very small muzzle compared to other Godzillas. And this head is close, like this would be fine. But it looks a little goofy and cartoonish, and that's not the feeling I want Legendary Godzilla to have. So I want him to have a little more slim profiled head. So I'm trying some other ways to get that smaller snout, but a face that still conveys this version of Godzilla. And it's tricky. This one gave me some trouble for a while, which is often the case with the head feature for builds like this. And so I think I finally got a snout the way I like it, and now trying to get the face and eyes built is still giving me trouble. Until I finally decide we'll go minimalistic. This Godzilla has really tiny eyes, so we'll just keep the eyes small, as in invisible. So, minimalistic head ends up working out, and now we're to the coloring section, which is always an interesting section of these builds for me, because for any of you who don't know, I am colorblind. So I am mostly going off the names of the colors, and then I'm also guided by what colors are available for each kind of piece. Not all pieces come in all colors. I started out making Godzilla all black because this Godzilla typically is a mostly black color or very, very like asphalt gray color. But all black just didn't seem quite interesting and dynamic enough of a color. It seemed like it would end up being very flat and boring looking. So we're going with dark gray, blue spines so that it's the energy, like he's charging up his atomic breath, but also just to add a little bit more color to what's going to be a very gray build. And now I'm just trying to color correct the pieces that don't come in either of these colors. And right, at first I try black, but then I switch to light gray. And partially because of some of the pieces not coming in dark gray on the belly, but also just to break up his profile a bit more, I end up giving him counter shading again. Which does bring me to a point that I'm sure people who have been watching this series thus far have already been making jokes about or have realized, yes, I know that this makes 3 aquatic reptiles in a row for the builds I've done for this series. And I don't have an excuse for that. I promise I'm not doing it on purpose. The topics come up randomly. Turtle, it had to be Archelon because it's the biggest turtle. The only fun build I could think of for the Bone Wars was Cope's Elasmosaur, and this one was Godzilla, which is a marine reptile. I promise the next one will not be scaly and won't be swimming. It'll be something on land, and it will stay away from the water. But there you go. That's my build of Godzilla 2014 in honor of our Silver Screen Science Godzilla episodes. As always, if you are interested in building this set yourself, you can find a link to the instructions and the parts list down in the description. If you do build it, please share photos. We have a section in our Discord where you are welcome to post your Lego builds. I'd love to see if you build your own Godzilla. If you want to make modifications, feel free. Let me know what you do. If you decide to build your own version of Godzilla, please show me. I love to see people's builds. As always, thanks for watching. If you would like to check out the episode that inspired this build, you can find our episodes here on YouTube or any of your typical podcast providers. And if you'd like to support us, we have a Patreon with lots of extra goodies and extra content. More thoughts for our movie episodes like this one, and even bonus science news and discussion. Thanks again for watching, everyone. I'll see you next month for the next episode of Briks with Bask.